Welcome back for another episode of Leadership that Liberates. Before we get into today's topic and content, I really just wanted to say how fulfilling this process has been for me, how grateful I am that I finally, after years of avoidance, started this podcast, and how much it means to me to receive your feedback. I've heard so many beautiful reflections from so many of you, and it has been so life-giving and life-affirming and courage-building, motivating, inspiring. So thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for tuning in, for giving me your time and sharing in this process and experience with me, because it has really meant so much to me. And I'm really, really grateful. And today I want to continue to expand upon the conversations we've been having over the last couple of weeks. I shared with you my leadership framework and emphasized the importance of root work, which is essentially shadow work. And then I also shared with you last week about a process that I took myself through about a year ago, my own shadow work, root work process. And in today's episode, I would like to outline what that process looks like in a step-by-step way, because it is a process that I support other people in moving through. And I thought it could be useful and helpful to give you a breakdown of what that looks like and what that entails to support you in leading yourself through that process, giving you some context around what that looks like, what it might bring up, what kinds of questions we want to ask ourselves at each step of the process. I also want to share a couple of examples from clients of mine, because I think they really highlight how this can take different shape and form, regardless of what the quote unquote outcome is or what we uncover through the process of root work. You can see how people are being shaped by certain types of experiences that then show up in their lives in very particular ways and impact the way that they perceive themselves, relate to other people, and engage in the world. This process of root work, which is, as we said, actually shadow work, there's kind of four core steps or parts of the process. And I do move people through them in a linear way, but I also want to emphasize that this isn't a linear process, that it is something that you kind of move between steps one, two, three, four, two, four, one, three. It is very fluid in that sense, even though we can contain this process within a 4 week to 6 week time span. It is a process that continues evolving and unfolding throughout the course of one's life. We've spent 20, 30, 40 years operating under certain unconscious beliefs, operating within certain unconscious behaviors and patterns. And we have essentially trained ourselves to do those things in ways that we don't have to think about, because it's been a practice. We've practiced doing them. And to unlearn those processes also requires practice. That's why we really can actually get clarity and gain awareness very quickly through this process. And creating the changes that are effective and sustainable and embodied, that is a process of practice. That does not happen in the same expedited way as coming to awareness does, which is part of the reason why this process really requires us to have so much grace and compassion with ourselves, because it can be really easy, especially when we orient to the world in the ways that we've been programmed or conditioned to. It can be easy to be hard on ourselves. Part of going through this process is helping us realize why and how that sort of harshness or judgment or self-criticism really doesn't serve. And in many ways is part of why we are now confronted with these things that are so deeply embedded within our subconscious and unconscious mind. Root work, shadow work, for me, they're the same thing. Different terms probably resonate with different people. As I shared before, I do think that shadow work tends to have a lot of misperception or misconception attached to it. But really, it's root work, right? It's looking at what is under the surface, what's actually going on in ways that are sort of hidden or out of view for us. And so the first part of this process is illuminating the shadow, identifying the shadow, or exploring the soil we were planted in. If we're going to use the metaphor of the tree in my framework, it is this process of looking at what was happening in the soil that shaped the roots of our being. This first part of this process, this first step, so to speak, is really getting clear on everything that has shaped us and how, and gathering information through that about what has been repressed or hidden outside of our conscious awareness. How has the environment we grew up in shaped our self-perception, our view of others, and our overall perspective about the world? We're looking at our ancestry, our lineage, intergenerational trauma, which oftentimes that kind of becomes more clear later after we've identified the shadows, but we're considering the role that those things have played. Our family of origin or primary caretakers, their patterns of behavior, the way that they related to the world, our cultural context, the beliefs and values and overall worldview of the society within which we were raised. Again, considering the role and influence of systems of oppression and how those shaped and influenced the societies or cultural contexts we grew up in. And for some people, that may have been multiple societies and cultural contexts, considering the role of our identities, our roles within our family, within community. All of these are different aspects and elements of the soil we were planted in. When I'm working with people through this process, at each step, I'm giving them a set of questions to reflect on, because it is really through their responses to these questions that we begin to identify and illuminate the shadow or what has been hidden. What's very interesting about this process is as I have people go through these reflections and share them with me, I will ask them, like, what patterns do you see? What threads do you see running through your responses? And people most often can identify one or two things. But I would say the one thing that feels to me like the most dominant or prominent thread running throughout their answers, which ends up becoming the focus of our work together, is something they cannot see. They do not actually see that thread. And again, it's because it's part of the shadow. So it's not known to them. This is something that is happening outside of their conscious awareness, which is why it can be really useful or beneficial to have an outside perspective. The first part of this process is where we really have to explore a lot of different things. And so there are a lot of different questions to consider. But for you, if this is something that you're interested in, one important question is, what was I praised for as a child and what was I punished for as a child? Because that gives you insight into who you believed you should be or needed to be, and what parts of yourself were quote unquote bad or wrong or shameful. So it ends up being a reflection of the parts of yourself that you amplified for approval, and the parts of yourself that you diminished because you associated those parts of yourself with some sort of negative consequence, like being rejected or abandoned or criticized or judged. Another question that's really useful in this part of the process is, what do I most judge or criticize other people for? Because what's so interesting about the shadow is because we're not able to see it, we don't consciously recognize or realize why we are so activated by certain things in other people. And so, what often happens is that what we are judging or criticizing other people for is usually one, a quality that we are not able to see within ourselves, something we don't like about ourselves, but don't realize we don't like about ourselves because it's in the shadow. And so we are activated when someone else displays that quality or characteristic because it is reflecting to us something we don't like within ourselves, but have not yet consciously acknowledged within ourselves. And the second is that often it can also represent a quality that someone else gives themselves permission to express that we have not allowed ourselves to express. Again, it's been put into the shadow, probably because we were punished or criticized for it. And so then we're activated when we see someone else expressing themselves freely in a way where we have actually denied or disowned that possibility for ourselves. And this gets into something called projection, which I am going to do a whole episode about eventually. But these are important questions to ask ourselves. And then another thing we do in this first part of the process is we explore the role that you play in relationships. Typically, you will find that a lot of how you're relating to other people is rooted in the role you had to play within your family of origin or in relation to your caretakers, to the point where it becomes part of what you think is your personality. But it's actually just the way in which you were almost forced to relate to other people or to the world. And then what happens is we get into these patterns of playing this role, and we will unconsciously gravitate toward people who allow us to play that role. And that's why very often people joke like, oh, I'm dating my mother, I'm dating my father. It's like, well, yeah, oftentimes we're doing that because we're unconsciously putting ourselves in a role that feels comfortable. So we also do a lot of exploration around relationship patterns in this first part of the process. Okay, the second part of the process is, once we've identified and illuminated the shadows and what's actually playing out in ways we haven't been aware of, then we move into this part of the process that is really about acceptance and accepting that part of ourselves that we have shamed or suppressed. It's really about honoring the role that that shadow has played. In other words, this is where we tend to the roots of our being. We really give ourselves so much grace and compassion and love because we can recognize that this unconscious belief or this unconscious pattern is a self-protective mechanism. We have suppressed this part of ourselves to keep ourselves safe in some way, to ensure that our needs are met, to ensure that we receive acceptance and belonging, which is something that we actually really need as humans. In this part of the process, we're trying to understand why the shadow exists in the first place and what purpose has it served in meeting our needs. How has that actually been good for us up to a certain point? And also understanding, how is that now limiting us or holding us back or maybe causing us harm in some way? So a question to ask at this second step or stage of the process is how has it served or protected me to repress this part of myself, to put this quality or characteristic into the shadow? How has that actually been serving me? When we can really understand the role that it's played, we really have so much compassion for ourselves because we can see that that was necessary for us at one point in time to have our needs met. The third part of the process is shadow integration. That's bringing that part of ourselves into the fullness of who we are so that we're not fragmented, right? There isn't this part of us that's cast away and hidden off and buried in the dirt, but it actually becomes part of our identity in a way that isn't based in shame, but is rooted in this compassionate perspective and allowing ourselves to integrate that part into who we are in a way that's healthy and nurtures us and supports us. And so, to use the tree metaphor, this is really about watering the seeds of our power, our purpose, our potential in order to fortify our foundations so that there is that support there to hold us as we bloom and blossom into this vibrant, thriving tree. In this process of shadow integration, again, we're really identifying constructive ways to express this part of ourselves and to start to cultivate a more self-empowered concept around how we perceive that. As an example, so many people repress anger. And so many people who repress anger do that because they have seen anger be expressed in really unhealthy, dysfunctional, destructive ways that were very harmful. So, very often, a person who had a very angry, explosive, abusive parent will suppress anger completely. I'm not angry, I'm sad. That's the most common way that we mask our anger. It's sadness. And this was like a whole shadow work process I had to take myself through many years ago when I realized I was doing this. What happens though is the energy of that suppressed anger, it is bubbling and boiling and building up, and it does express itself in other ways, even if it doesn't look like the kind of anger that we witnessed. But essentially, a lot of people are suppressing anger because they don't want to be like this person or that person who expressed anger in destructive ways. And so part of what we would do in this stage of the process is we would redefine what it means to be angry and what that might look like. There are healthy, constructive ways to feel and express anger. We don't have to model the dysfunction that was modeled for us. We don't have to replicate it. That's part of what we would do in this phase of shadow integration. How can I relate to this feeling, to this quality, to this characteristic in a new way where I'm not orienting to it from a place of judgment or shame, because I'm learning how to be with it in a way that's actually constructive and conducive to my own well-being and to a functional, healthy connection and relationship. And so, an important question to ask ourselves is, what are specific situations or circumstances or types of people that tend to activate my shame or my judgment around this part of self? Or to maybe activate the fear around, if I show this part of myself, I'm going to face some kind of consequence that leads to exclusion or rejection or abandonment or whatever it might be. So we're starting to track how we're relating to the world. Where am I being triggered or activated around this thing? And just noticing how and where that shows up so that when it happens, we can actually be in a space to choose how we respond rather than to react in this self-protective way, which is rooted in the shadow and is very often unconscious to us. Becoming aware of the types of situations or people that trigger or activate us helps us in the future consciously choose how we respond to that situation or that person. And then finally, the last step in this process of shadow work or root work is embodiment. And that's actually expressing this quality in more healthy and constructive ways. In the sense of the tree metaphor, this is about standing tall and sovereign in the tree of our being. So it's grounded expansion. We are so deeply rooted in our self-knowing and in the truth of who we are because we're doing this process of shadow work to become a lot more self-aware. And so how am I then being grounded in that truth of who I am in a way that is holding me and supporting me to expand into expressing more of my truth in the world? What I noted before about self-awareness is important because the people I work with are very self-aware. So it's not that you have so much shadow because you're not doing any work on yourself and you're not reflective and you're not engaging in self-inquiry. No. Like the people I work with are incredibly self-aware individuals. And these are parts of themselves that they aren't aware of because that's part of our human experience and human nature is to suppress things that create shame and things that feel out of alignment with who we believe ourselves to be or who we want to be in the world. And so we all have these shadows. I can't tell you how many people I have worked with who have mentored me and supported me and coached me, who have said to me, "You are one of the most self-aware people I've ever worked with." And I am constantly uncovering shadows. I am always discovering things about myself that I hadn't been aware of for 15, 20, 25, 30, 35 plus years. It's not that you have shadows because you're not self-aware. You can be very self-aware and still have so many shadows running your life because that's just part of the process of our psychological development as children. It's just normal that we have shadows. So I just wanted to note that because so many people, when they begin to uncover their shadows, it can bring up a sense of shame. But it's so important to understand that this is such a normal part of the human experience. And it's actually the shame that put that part of you into the shadow in the first place. So the shame doesn't serve us. And I just feel like shame is one of the most destructive things in the world. It's really at the source of so many of our issues individually and collectively. Through this fourth stage of embodiment, part of what we're doing is helping you, supporting you to envision a future where you have integrated your shadows, where you are operating from this conscious awareness and making these conscious choices. When you are fully expressed in that way, what positive changes will you experience in your life, in your work, in your relationships, in your leadership? We really anchor into what might happen that's great and good and liberating and freeing. What might happen on the other side that actually gives you more agency and autonomy in your own lived experience. This part of the process can be so exciting and it can activate so much fear because we have spent our whole lives performing in a way and wearing masks. So what we experience as we move toward the embodiment of the shadow integration is this process of expanding and contracting. So we will expand and then we will have an experience that activates that fear, and then we will contract because our nervous system has trained us to operate in ways that feel very comfortable and safe. And as we start to put ourselves in situations that are unfamiliar because they're outside of this pattern. So here we're building our capacity to stretch a little bit into that discomfort, but not too far that it's so dysregulating that we can't actually be there. So we are going to be in this process of expanding and moving toward this embodied sense of self. And then we're going to contract a little bit, so it's almost like, if you've ever seen those videos of flowers blooming in a very expedited time lapse where time is sped up, you can actually see that the flower, as it's blooming, it's constantly contracting in the process of the bloom. It opens and then it closes, and then it opens a bit more and it closes, and it opens more and it closes again. And that's just this natural process of blossoming and blooming. And so that's a natural part of our process as well as we build our capacity. And so part of building our capacity is identifying ways that we can create safety around the expansion. A really good way to expand our capacity is to surround ourselves with people who really are supportive. And even if it's just one or two people who you're kind of bringing your fears to and you're showing up vulnerably, those people are going to help you build capacity because they're going to help you build courage. And they help you build courage because they offer you support and unconditional love. Part of creating safety around expansion is putting ourselves in situations where we can safely expand, which is also for many of us going to be unfamiliar and uncomfortable because part of the way that we've learned to orient to the world is through limitation and through making ourselves small and through silencing our voices. And so it is very confronting to do this work in a lot of ways. And again, that's why compassion is so key. And I like to say that there are three key practices that are part of this process, and they are curiosity, courage, and compassion. And curiosity is there because we have to question why we do things in the way we do, why we respond to life in the way we do, why we think about things as we do. And we're just being curious about that. And curiosity implies non-judgment. I wonder why I just reacted that way. I wonder why that thing just irritated me so much. What might that mean? What could that be reflecting or representing to me? So it's curiosity and then courage because this work is hard, because it is confronting and it requires bravery. Honestly, it does. That's why so many of us don't do it because it is so uncomfortable and it's easier to choose our comfort. It just is. It's easier to choose what is comfortable to us. And so it takes a lot of courage to confront these parts of ourselves and to move through this process. And then, of course, the main ingredient is the compassion. Because as we uncover things that are confronting and uncomfortable, we have to give them so much compassion, give ourselves so much compassion through the process. Because again, the judgment and the shame only reinforces why these things were in the shadow in the first place. So I'd love to share with you now a couple of examples from my clients. I have changed names for confidentiality. So the first client we're going to talk about is Morgan. And Morgan came to me because he was feeling really anxious and fearful in his relationships. He was noticing that he was very easily triggered by other people, and he just couldn't understand, like, why am I always afraid? Why can I never speak or share or say what I need to say? And so we walked through this process, and in the first part of the process, what really emerged for Morgan was that he had a lot of judgment and criticism toward people who were very emotionally closed off. But he also had a lot of judgment and criticism toward people who were overly expressive and confident in their self-expression. And Morgan had this pattern for the most part of being with partners who were very emotionally closed off, despite the fact that this was something Morgan really judged or disliked in people. Another thing that was interesting was that Morgan really disliked when people complained. And so, as we went through this process of shadow work, what we uncovered is that when he was about 10 or 11 years old, Morgan's mother began to treat him more like a friend than a child. And she would confide in him about things and talk to him about her relationships. There just wasn't this kind of mother-child relationship. It was more like, you're my confidant. And through that, Morgan learned to take on the role of space holder, to be the one who listened. And that's why Morgan played that role in relationships as well. What's interesting is that actually what's going on here is that Morgan is the one who is emotionally closed off because Morgan has learned not to express himself. And so he plays the role of space holder and listener because that allows him to remain silent and closed off. And from Morgan's perspective, that also made him valuable to other people. His usefulness was reflected in his ability to hold space. Part of what's happening with having partners who are a little bit emotionally closed off and not vulnerable themselves is that lack of intimacy also allowed Morgan to stay in this role of not being self-expressive, feeling as though he needed to support other people in expressing themselves, again, giving himself permission not to express himself. The thing about complaining, which Morgan judged, was also interesting because we uncovered that another aspect of the dynamic with his mother is that she often made Morgan and his siblings feel guilty if they expressed their needs or their challenges, because she would say to them, "Oh, but you're making me worry. That's hard for me because now I'm concerned about you." So essentially, they learned, I can't express my needs because it's going to have a negative impact on somebody else. It's going to hurt somebody else if I tell them how I feel. And that self-expression, expressing one's needs, Morgan then began to associate with complaining. And so then Morgan really disliked when he perceived that people were complaining or that people were expressing themselves with confidence, because both of those things were reflecting something that Morgan had not given himself permission to do. He had not given himself permission to express his needs. And he certainly hadn't given himself permission to express them with confidence. Morgan was constantly suppressing his wants, suppressing his needs, not expressing or sharing boundaries with people because he was worried about how that would affect them and impact them because of how it had affected and impacted his mom when he was younger. Morgan wasn't feeling heard in his relationships but it was actually because he was never expressing himself. He was never actually using his voice to be heard. And this is what was creating this constant anxiety and this fear, because within Morgan, there were all these things that he wanted to say and all the ways that he essentially wanted to stand up for himself, but wouldn't allow himself. And he would tell himself stories like, your needs aren't important, and you're going to inconvenience people if you complain about what you need and want. And you're then not upholding this role of safe, supportive listener if you take on the role of this needy complainer. Morgan was feeling all of this anxiety in relationship because he wasn't allowing himself to be himself. This was also about avoidance of self-expression and the potential of hurting other people. And after we had done this shadow work together, Morgan and I worked together in another context, another capacity later, which was around their self-expression and social activism. So Morgan is a writer, a poet, a creative, and also an activist. And this was playing out in their leadership as well, because Morgan was suppressing his voice. He was experiencing writer's block. We uncovered that that was also related to this, because he was censoring himself so much. And part of that is actually very similar to what I shared last week that was coming up for me. There was an unconscious belief for him as well that he wasn't allowed to speak on these certain subjects, that he, in terms of identity, wasn't credible to speak about certain things. And so he was experiencing writer's block, but it was actually because he wasn't giving himself the freedom to express himself. So that's one example of the ways in which somebody might really make themselves smaller to be palpable and to be, from Morgan's perspective, useful and of service. Another example is with a client of mine who we're going to call Rachel. And Rachel came to me because she kept finding herself in these kind of toxic, codependent dynamics with narcissistic men. She was able to identify that this was a case of dating her dad, in a sense. She was aware that these people were very similar to her father. But there was obviously more going on under the surface, and that's why she wanted to work with me. In this first part of the root work, shadow work process, in asking these questions, what do you judge or criticize in other people? What was coming through was she really didn't like when people were emotionally immature, in the sense that they would not take responsibility for their actions. And she really didn't like people who were manipulative. And she really didn't like people who played the victim in a situation. Again, because that is a reflection of somebody who won't take accountability for their actions. What she's describing of what she judges and criticizes is basically her father, somebody who is narcissistic, and because of that always feels as though they're the victim in a situation and will just never take any responsibility for their own role or their own actions, just feels like everything is happening to them. And as we went through this process, what Rachel uncovered and realized for herself is that essentially, through her experience as a child, she felt very powerless. She was, in many ways, a victim. And she was constantly being judged or criticized for everything she did. She was constantly being guilt tripped for everything she said or thought. She had no agency or autonomy to really be herself in her life, and she felt very powerless in her context and in her situation. And what she was doing is in these relationships with these people who were actually very much like her father, is she was manipulating them in order to have control and to have power, to feel powerful. She would manipulate them into treating her badly so that she would then be the victim in the situation. Everything she describes, she doesn't like, and the things that she judges or criticizes. And she consciously was aware that she was manipulative, but she wasn't consciously aware that she was manipulating situations to actually be the victim within that situation. From her perspective, she was manipulating people and circumstances in order to maintain control and power over them so that she felt like she had some sense of agency and autonomy that she didn't have when she was younger. But unconsciously, she was doing it so that she would be the victim. What we realized through this process of uncovering all this was that she was doing that so that she could experience resolution, so that she could have a different outcome. Through being a victim, the unconscious hope or desire was that she would be vindicated, that there would be a sense of justice, that this other person would acknowledge that they were harming her, that they would take responsibility, even though she was kind of manipulating the situation so that she was in that position and so that she was harmed. But the unconscious desire was to experience justice. So she kept unconsciously putting herself in the same pattern, in the same situation, because the hope was that she would experience a different outcome. This was a generational pattern. So she learned that this is what power looks like through her mother and through her grandmother, because that's how both of them exercised power. And so she had absorbed and internalized that from watching them do it. And for her, that's what power was. What she really wanted was to experience relationships with a lot of depth and intimacy where connection was really intense, but she also perceived vulnerability to be a weakness. To be powerful, you can't be vulnerable. And so part of what we had to do in her process is redefine her understanding of power. And how can you actually be powerful in operating in integrity? How can you actually be powerful in being vulnerable with somebody and having intimate connection? You see how it took these two very different forms, and it speaks to something I shared 1 or 2 episodes ago around how some of us internalize our experiences and blame ourselves and therefore make ourselves small. And some of us externalize and put blame on others. And through that process, we need to have control or power over others. I almost feel like you see the world divided along those lines in a sense of people who have internalized their pain versus people who have externalized their pain. And we are processing unconsciously that pain in very different ways. Some of us are actually choosing powerlessness. We're unconsciously creating the conditions to be without power. And some of us are choosing to have power and control, but actually, what is the illusion of power and control? To be powerful, when really that's also rooted in disempowerment. Because in neither case or situation are we acting from the sovereignty of our being, from the truth of who we are, from our own integrity of being in coherence and congruence with ourselves, because we have denied ourselves, again, to protect ourselves and to cope with the conditions of our environment, of the soil that we were planted in, and the ways that we learn to relate to ourselves and to other people and to the world around us through the soil we were planted in, then becomes the way we move through and navigate the world and show up in the world in ways that we're not aware of. And that's why this process is so potent and so powerful and so important, why it's so necessary, actually. That is the root work process in a snapshot and with some examples. If you're interested in going through this process with me, I would love to do that with you. I do think after May, I am going to shift the structure and format of the way I've been doing this and extend it from 6 weeks to 6 months, which is obviously going to reflect in the investment of the experience. But if you want to do the 6 week version, get in touch with me before the end of May and we can make that happen. I also facilitate this process for groups. So if you have a team, an organization, it's really powerful to do this together with a group of people because it really gives us an in-depth opportunity to experience our shared humanity through our stories. And because shame is created in the context of relationship, it also needs to be dissolved and dissipated through connection relationship. And so it can be very powerful to do this process together with a group of people. And of course, there are steps we would take to create a sense of safety in doing that with other people, because it's obviously a different experience to do it with a group than it is one-on-one. That's the root work process in action. Thank you for tuning in, for listening or watching. And I will see you next time for the next episode of Leadership That Liberates.